Just hours ago, a quiet command executed inside the Pentagon effectively fractured the most secure aerospace alliance in human history. In the last 24 hours, the United States military did something security analysts believed was technologically and politically impossible. It began systematically decoupling Canada from the high-level satellite encryption networks that govern the defense of North American airspace. This changes everything. The continental shield that has protected the Northern Hemisphere since the dawn of the Cold War has just fractured, and it happened in total silence. This was never supposed to happen because the global defense structure relies on the absolute integration of Washington and Ottawa. But the Pentagon just found a massive vulnerability, a hidden capability to sever data streams without warning, and they chose this moment to pull the plug. This is global power shift, where hidden conflicts are decoded. Subscribe, like, and stay ahead, because this is just the beginning. What appeared to be a standard diplomatic disagreement over military budget metrics has transformed into a terrifying, real-time national security emergency. The official trigger seemed routine, a bureaucratic announcement that the Pentagon was pausing its participation in the historic Permanent Joint Board on Defense. But that was just the public cover. Behind closed doors, the United States has frozen the delivery of Canada's highly anticipated fleet of 88 F-35 Lightning II stealth fighters. More importantly, Washington has severed the next-generation satellite encryption links that allow Canadian tracking systems to read real-time American aerospace data. The balance of power has shifted, not across the Atlantic or the Pacific, but right along the 49th parallel. Military analysts are already warning that this single technical intervention creates an immediate and catastrophic blind spot across thousands of miles of Arctic airspace. To understand the sheer scale of this collapse, you have to understand the numbers. The Joint North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD, monitors over 10 million square miles of airspace. It relies on a seamless digital matrix where American space-based infrared sensors feed data directly into cross-border tracking stations. But within the last day, those data streams were hit with an unprecedented encryption lock. The United States did not shut down the radars. They simply changed the digital keys. What this means is that Canadian operators are looking at screens that are rapidly going dark, cut off from the primary satellite feeds that detect high-altitude threats before they enter the continental perimeter. The strategic surprise catching intelligence agencies completely off guard is that the United States had a built-in mechanism to isolate its data architecture. For decades, the security community believed that NORAD was an indivisible system, that you could not separate American sensors from Canadian response units without destroying the entire network. That belief was a dangerous illusion. The truth is that the Pentagon has spent the last 3 years quietly upgrading its space surveillance network under a completely isolated proprietary encryption protocol. They told Ottawa these upgrades were standard software maintenance. In reality, it was a data segregation architecture designed for this exact scenario. It was a strategic trap, a hidden backdoor that allows Washington to maintain total situational awareness while leaving its northern neighbor completely blind to the next-generation tracking layer. The technical explanation for how this system functions reveals a deep, hidden dependency that Ottawa completely failed to calculate. Modern aerospace defense no longer relies on ground-based radar arrays scanning the horizon. It depends on low Earth orbit satellite constellations that detect heat signatures, electromagnetic emissions, and radar reflections. These satellites feed data into automated combat systems using a secure protocol known as Link 16 and its highly classified successors. When the United States froze the F-35 deliveries, they did not just stop the physical aircraft from leaving the factory floors in Texas. They severed the digital integration codes. To simplify it clearly, the United States essentially revoked Canada's password to the ultimate air defense network. Without those next-generation encryption keys, Canada's existing military infrastructure cannot communicate with the newer satellites floating directly over its own Arctic territory. This hidden dependency means that Canada's entire national sovereignty is tethered to an infrastructure it does not own and cannot control. For years, Ottawa assumed that its geographic position made its security guaranteed, believing the United States would always defend the northern approach to protect itself. But that's not the real problem. The real issue is that the threat matrix has evolved past simple geographic containment. Advanced hypersonic glide vehicles, stealth cruise missiles, and high-altitude surveillance platforms move at speeds that require instantaneous, automated, machine-to-machine target handoffs. If your systems take even 5 seconds to translate an unencrypted data feed, the target is already gone. And that is where everything breaks down. The data mismatch between old Canadian infrastructure and new American satellite tracking has effectively caused a total system failure at the worst possible geographic choke point on Earth. This single failure has triggered a fast, uncontrollable, and irreversible chain reaction collapse across the entire northern defense grid. When the satellite links were restricted, the legacy Canadian tracking platforms, which still rely heavily on aging radar networks, attempted to calibrate with the American space assets. Because the encryption keys did not match, the automated sorting algorithms flagged the data mismatch as a host system corruption. Within hours, the digital bridge connecting the Canadian Air Operations Centre in North Bay, Ontario, to the central NORAD hub in Colorado Springs began dropping packets of information. The operational effect was immediate. Strike missions failed to sync. Aircraft tracking systems lose target clarity, and the overall missile intercept capability across the northern perimeter drops significantly. It is a cascading malfunction that cannot be repaired by a simple software patch because it is driven by an intentional political and military blockade. Intelligence reports suggest that foreign adversaries are already moving to exploit this sudden gap. For the past 24 hours, long-range maritime patrol assets and electronic reconnaissance vessels from competing powers have ticked up their activity along the periphery of the Beaufort Sea and the Chukchi Cap. They know the grid is fractured. They understand that if Canada cannot receive the satellite telemetry from American infrared tracking networks, a low-flying stealth asset could theoretically cross deep into northern airspace before ground-based arrays pick it up. The impenetrable Arctic shield has been reduced to a patchwork of disconnected sensors. This changes everything, turning a secure zone of cooperation into a massive intelligence gap that threatens the stability of the entire Western Hemisphere. Defense experts understand that Ottawa now faces an absolute crisis with zero easy answers. A comprehensive options analysis reveals that every single logical response available to Canadian leadership is structurally flawed, prohibitively expensive, or geopolitically impossible. There is no good option left on the table. The first option would be for Canada to immediately capitulate to Washington's demands, rapidly rewriting its federal budget to allocate billions of dollars to hit the newly mandated 3.5% NATO core military spending target. But this option fails under the weight of harsh economic reality. Canada is currently wrestling with a technical recession, lagging industrial productivity, and an overextended fiscal deficit. Forcing an instantaneous doubling of the national defense budget would require extracting tens of billions of dollars from domestic infrastructure, healthcare, and social systems. The financial shock would trigger an immediate structural collapse of the domestic economy, causing massive political instability and public panics on a scale the country has not seen in decades. You cannot build a credible military on top of a broken economy. The second option is for Ottawa to completely abandon the American F-35 program and rapidly pivot to alternative international aerospace suppliers, such as procuring European Gripen or Rafale fighter jets. This option breaks down instantly on the hard reality of technical interoperability. The entire North American continent is physically wired for American military standards. Switching to a European platform would require a complete ground-up overhaul of every maintenance bay, every refueling nozzle, every communication tower, and every weapons cache from Vancouver to Halifax. It would take over a decade and hundreds of billions of dollars to execute, during which time the aging fleet of Canadian CF-18 fighters would completely deteriorate, leaving the country with absolutely zero air combat capability during the transition period. The third option would be for Canada to attempt to build an entirely independent, sovereign satellite tracking and space surveillance network from scratch. This option is a technological impossibility within any meaningful time frame. Developing, launching, and deploying a functional low Earth orbit military satellite constellation requires an industrial aerospace base that Canada simply does not possess in a standalone capacity. Even if Ottawa poured every cent of its national treasury into space research, the country remains completely dependent on foreign launch providers, foreign component manufacturing, and foreign rocket systems. You cannot build strategic autonomy when your primary industrial supply chains are still bound by international export controls and foreign corporate licensing agreements. The fourth option is the most dangerous, a theoretical diplomatic pivot where Canada attempts to diversify its strategic partnerships away from North America entirely, forming isolated, deep security and trade alliances with middle powers in Europe and Asia to hedge against American pressure. But this option ignores the immutable laws of geography. Canada shares the longest undefended land border in the world with the United States. Its economy is structurally integrated with the American market through the CUSMA trade agreement. Any attempt to form an independent security bloc would be viewed by Washington as an existential threat to its own continental perimeter. The economic retaliation from the United States would be swift, brutal, and total, completely shutting down cross-border supply chains and bankrupting Canadian industry within a matter of days. The final reality is that there is no escape from this strategic trap. Washington knows it holds all the cards, and the Pentagon is using this technical data freeze to send an unmistakable message to every middle power in the global alliance network. The era of the free security umbrella is officially over. What this means is that the United States is no longer willing to underwrite the defense of nations that do not align their internal economic and industrial priorities with the global strategic demands of the Pentagon. The reality is that the suspension of data sharing is a live-fire exercise in geopolitical coercion, using the ultimate technological leverage to force absolute compliance. This local friction is already triggering a massive global escalation, altering how alliances are calculated across every ocean. In Europe, smaller NATO members are watching the North American split with absolute terror. If the United States is willing to blind its closest neighbor, its literal continental partner, then no treaty or historical bond is truly safe. Defense ministries in Prague, Copenhagen, and The Hague are frantically realizing that checking boxes on paper is no longer sufficient. The global security architecture is shifting from an input-based alliance system to a ruthless operational output system. The truth is that Washington is building a new world order framed around hard capabilities, advanced weapons integration, and immediate compliance. If you cannot field the forces, if you cannot secure your piece of the grid, you will be systematically excluded from the ultimate intelligence apparatus. This reality places immense psychological pressure on leadership in Ottawa as the public begins to realize the depth of the vulnerability. The panic is not just political, it is operational. Every military commander knows that an army that cannot see is an army that cannot fight. The sudden drop in intercept capability means that the national airspace is technically compromised. The future is deeply uncertain and dangerous because a system that took 70 years to construct has been compromised in a single afternoon by a digital protocol shift. The world is discovering that the lines on the map matter far less than the invisible encryption keys that control the data flowing across them. The continental shield is down, the data streams are locked, and the ultimate aerospace partnership has just evaporated into a cold, hard calculations of raw power. This leaves us with questions that will define the next decade of global stability. Can a middle power truly maintain its strategic sovereignty when its entire defense apparatus is digitally controlled by a superpower neighbor? What happens to the global balance of power when the world's most stable border becomes the site of an invisible, high-tech blockade? And if the sky above North America is no longer unified, who will be the first to exploit the crack in the shield?